Gerald Ford, 38th President of the United States, the accidental president. He was appointed, not elected. You'll see what we mean. Did you know that his real birth name was Leslie King? You see, that was his father's name. His father was from a wealthy family, and he married Dorothy Gardner. That was Gerald Ford's mom. Now, Leslie was a heavy drinker who beat and terrorized his wife Dorothy. And then, well, sometime later when they had their first baby, they named him Leslie, like the father. 2 weeks after the baby was born, Leslie beat Dorothy. Then he picked up a kitchen knife and he threatened to kill her and the baby. Dorothy, by that point, had had enough. She picked up the baby and ran away to her parents. Leslie Sr. never paid a penny of child support. But no matter, because Dorothy soon met this man, Gerald Ford Sr., a kind man, and they married. And they began calling little Leslie Jerry. And little Jerry didn't know that his stepfather was not his real dad until years later. Well, little Jerry became Big Jerry, grew strong, played football, got a job in a restaurant, and one day in walks his biological father, Leslie Sr., and he had a conversation with Jerry and introduced himself. Can you imagine the shock?
No, I am your father. No, it's not true. That's impossible.
After a short conversation, Leslie Sr. gave Jerry $25 and walked out. Well, Jerry, for him, that was that. When he became of age, he changed his name officially to Gerald Ford Jr., after the loving man who raised him. Gerald had a strong sense of right and wrong. He got this from his family and also from the Boy Scouts. When he went to the University of Michigan, where he played football, he befriended Willis Ward. And when Georgia Tech University refused to play if there was a black man on the field, Jerry threatened to quit the team. Ward convinced him to stay, and this influenced Ford to later support civil rights and affirmative action in university policy. As for Ward, though a star athlete, he was disillusioned and left sports not long after. He became a lawyer and then a judge. Ford became a lawyer, served honorably in the Navy during World War II, and then he married Betty Bloomer. Now, Betty was a former dancer, and she had been married before. Some felt this relationship would hurt Ford as he began his political career. It didn't. He worked his way to become House Minority Leader. And Betty, she was very outspoken. She influenced Ford, who supported women's rights, civil rights, and even gay rights back then. Remember, this was the 60s. Later in the White House, Betty Ford would suffer breast cancer and had a double mastectomy. And she spoke openly about it at a time when people didn't talk about these things. In fact, a lot of women weren't even getting themselves checked. Well, her coming forward made it easier for people to discuss this. She raised awareness. She also unfortunately had a drinking problem, and she dealt openly with it, making it easier for others to come forward and get help. She helped form the Betty Ford Center for Substance Abuse. Ford served in the Warren Commission to investigate Kennedy's assassination, and later when Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned, President Nixon needed somebody to take his place, somebody who people trusted. He chose Gerald Ford, who at the time was thinking of retiring. And then when Nixon resigned after the scandal of Watergate, just like that, Gerald Ford became President of the United States without even getting elected. In his swearing in, he said, "I have not sought this enormous responsibility, but I will not shirk from it. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." He then asked for all to purge their hearts of suspicion and hate. He then chose Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. But then, bombshell. Ford pardoned Nixon of all wrongdoings, and many people felt betrayed. They felt that a deal had been made, that Nixon had avoided jail time when many of his staff had gone to jail covering for him. Ford felt the country needed to get past the scandal and that he had to put an end to it. To prolong the affair for years would occupy government time, and to see a former president in prison would be devastating for Nixon and for the country. Now, this decision might have been right or wrong, but it haunted his short presidency. Ford also gave a partial presidential pardon to those Americans who ran off to Canada to avoid going to Vietnam. He also named Gerald Ford the new CIA director. Now, after the United States signed the peace treaty with North Vietnam, came the painful process of getting the American troops out. And when the South Vietnamese saw the Americans were leaving for good, they stormed the embassy, got on military ships, and crowded their way on. Helicopters were pushed into the ocean to make room. Refugees made their way to the United States on boats, and thousands were accepted. North Vietnam would soon take over South Vietnam and make the country one under a communist government. In Cambodia, Pol Pot had taken over, and genocide led to the death of up to 3 million people, a quarter of the population. And then Laos also went communist, but the U.S. had had enough. It was not stepping in. Now, after so many wars, the United States economy was in shambles, and Ford tried to get a handle on the inflation. He cut many social programs, but he refused to cut funding for education for the handicapped. Soon afterwards, a swine flu broke out, and Ford recommended vaccinations. Then, when New York City said it was broke and asked for a bailout, Ford at first said no. Well, they criticized Ford so drastically that Ford somewhat gave in and aided the city. Ford hired Dick Cheney to be his new chief of staff, and he also signed an agreement with the Soviets for arms trade agreements that included human rights. After civil rights protests, protesting the Vietnam War, and then protesting against Nixon, the people had like a national hangover, you could say, and people started making fun of Gerald Ford as a bumbling fool. It was all in good fun. Gerald Ford had a propensity to just fall down, and even Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live made a career on the show by just imitating Gerald Ford as some kind of bumbling fool. Gerald Ford kind of got into this, and 30 years later on The Simpsons, well, Ford was still being made fun of.
Why don't you come over and watch the game, and we'll have nachos and then some beer.
Ooh. Jerry, I think you and I are going to get along just fine.
Then, in California, a 27-year-old Louise Fromm pulled a gun out on Gerald Ford while he was walking through a crowd. She was arrested, of course, and it turned out that Louise Fromm was part of Charles Manson's cult family. After this, well, Louise Fromm got national attention. Believe it or not, 3 weeks later, another woman, Sarah Moore, tried to kill Gerald Ford. Now, she managed to get off a shot. She missed Ford but injured a taxi cab driver. And before she could take another shot, she was pushed down and arrested. And a few weeks after that, a woman was taking a picture of Gerald Ford when her camera flashbulb exploded and a piece hit Ford in the head. Secret Service jumped on the lady, but of course, she was not arrested. Then came July 4th, 1976. The United States was 200 years old. It was the bicentennial celebration. And bicentennial was a theme of everything, parades, clothes, you name it. It was a very happy, proud time. It was election year, and Ford decided to try to win the presidency by his own right. Now, he told Vice President Rockefeller that he was too liberal and regretfully was going to ask Bob Dole to be the vice presidential candidate. But Rockefeller had no hard feelings, and he even campaigned for Ford. And when some spectators booed him, well, he gave them the finger. Many found this crude, but Ford found it funny. 3 years later, Rockefeller was found dead of a heart attack while in the company of an aide, Megan Markham. She was 25, he was 70. Now, the Democrats had chosen a one-term governor of Georgia, former peanut farmer named Jimmy Carter, as their presidential nominee, and he ran a tough campaign. It was going to be uphill for Ford as the people wanted change, and he was being challenged within his own party by Governor Ronald Reagan from California. It was an uphill battle for Ford. The people wanted change. Running hard with the weight of Vietnam and Watergate on his and the party's shoulders, he actually made it a close race. But in the end, it was Jimmy Carter who won. During these years, 14-year-old Nadia Comaneci was the first Olympian to get a perfect score. The novel Roots became a TV series phenomenon. Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia was assassinated, and wealthy heiress Patty Hearst was kidnapped by a radical group that she eventually joined and assisted in a bank robbery where she was arrested. A Palestinian group hijacked a plane full of Israelis and landed in Entebbe airport in Uganda, where the president of Idi Amin gave them his blessings. But then the Israeli army came and rescued the Israeli hostages and brought them home. In China, Mao Zedong had died. His great leap forward had led to the death of millions. Big movies came out. There was Taxi Driver, The Godfather Part 2, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Chinatown, and Rocky. And so the country looked forward with hope, as they also looked back with affection at the relatively decent man who helped the nation for 2 short years in what was somewhat of a transitional era. He was exactly what was needed at the time. Ford would become the longest living president, passing away at 93 in 2006. This is Cool Talk.